time certain item at 1 p.m., which is the Investment Insight speaker with Jane Garvey from Meridian Infrastructure. So that gives us a 25 minutes to try to get through a little bit of our agenda. So I said that we were going to go to the Responsible Contractor Policy Neutrality Clause, which is item 11, and that's Brian and Alan.
Thank you.
Hey, Brian.
It's Brian, not Alan. So we worked together. We had their Alan and PCA's recommendations, and it was punted to legal to do our research and report back. We've done extensive research. We appreciate the Treasurer's Office input and the language that was provided. We did research, and we came up with some language that we're going to put into our contracts under a statement of values, which really is aspirational in nature, but I think really gets the point across. And so we will be working on including that in our contract templates.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Mr. Bartow. I just want to commend the staff for working diligently with the Treasurer's Office and with the promise to seek the language that would be incorporated as, again, aspirational language relative to organizational neutrality. I think we're very comfortable with the resolution and would hope that we can see the language and just give it our assent, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Betty?
Thanks, Harry, and thank you for the continued work on this. Could you just give an example of what would be a non-investment contract that this could apply to in terms of the extension of the neutrality clause? I mean, what would fall under this category? Is it really just every other contract, non-investment related?
It really is every other contract.
Okay.
It would be, again, it would be in a statement of values. It would be reflecting the values. And it would be key to the provisions of the National Labor Relations Act.
Okay.
And so that's the type of language that we're looking at as keying in our expectation that folks will follow the provisions of National Labor Relations Act.
Okay. And then also state contracting law as well, right?
Oh, yeah, state contract
Right.
laws.
Okay.
Yes, we're
All
not
right.
thinking
All right.
anything out.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments on that? All right, thanks, Brian. Alan, nothing to add? Okay, thanks. That finishes item 11. Still gives us about 15 minutes. So, Aisha, you prepared?
She was born ready here. Come on.
So we're going to item 12, which is the corporate governance 30/30 proposal. We have 15 minutes set aside for this item. So if we take the full 15 minutes, it brings us up close to our speaker at 1 p.m. Hi, Aisha. Hello. And this is a reminder, this is the item that the Treasurer's Office brought forward?
Correct.
Okay.
And this is... Hello, everyone.
And this is an information item as well.
Correct. And so I'm happy to address any questions. I think the idea behind this proposal is that we would definitely come back after proxy season. As everyone knows, we're in the height of proxy season right now. And so we would come back in July and talk about how the effect of the change that we made to our corporate governance principles last November, which was to vote against nominating committee and potentially the entire board in instances where they have not made progress in terms of diversity. And so these were some of the things that we talked about earlier, those companies where we've had a longstanding engagement and they've yet to make any progress on diversity. And then we were also going to talk about how to address the Treasurer's proposal of the 30 and 30. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Steve?
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Chair. And Aisha, thank you for the work that you guys have done and that you continue to do. I always feel that it's necessary, but probably not, to stipulate just what a great job the staff does in terms of identifying those folks who could do better in terms of diversity on their boards and knowing that you're diligently working through this. Just a couple of questions, and then I just want to alert the board that we will probably have be forthcoming with a proposal for the board to consider that actually is in sync with what the staff already does, but maybe adds a little bit more transparency and the like to the process, and from our perspective, more fully engages the board in decisions about how we go after companies who choose not to take any effort to be more diverse. And so Mike's expectation is that the July meeting will, and you have my commitment that we'll try to get the board and the staff something well in advance so you have a chance to review it and say what you like and don't like about it. It's drawn from, I should mention, numerous conversations we've had with other pension funds about how they approach the issue. And we tried to draw the sort of what we thought was the best of from those other pension funds and conversations that we've had there. And again, so it won't be that far out of line with what the staff already does, except for, I think, making it more public and more specific as to how we approach our proxy activity on issues solely related to diversity on boards. So, but with that, I do have a couple of questions about the item that you presented. So curious about the criteria that you're currently using, say, for those 27 companies that we're looking at during the 2018 proxy season, and in particular, because we're sensitive to this, are there things beyond just their board representation that would cause us to vote against either their governing committees or their full boards?
Specifically related to diversity or for other items? Because
Yeah.
there's always other things that we may vote against.
And that's, well, but it goes to my question, which is, so if we're looking at boards for how diverse they are, and we find somebody's resistant to incorporating any change whatsoever, that could be one factor from our perspective, but there could be other factors that you might want to consider before making that decision. And so I'm trying to understand what all the factors may be, and do you in fact go to those other factors in making your decision?
So I would say that the main factor would be our engagement and dialogue with those companies and trying to understand where they are in the process. Because as you may understand that these things don't happen overnight, so there needs to be an opening on the boardroom, or there needs to be an expansion of the board, or there needs to be some type of turnover. And it's where we see that turnover, and yet they're still being filled with everybody that looks already like they do on the board, white males. And so what we're looking for is action in terms of adding diverse members to the board.
I'm only chuckling because Chris is making motions with his face. He's the face of the people that we're voting against, I think. But having said that,
So
go ahead.
let me just say,
Yeah.
so if there's a company that they seem receptive to our ideas, and they're walking us through the process, and they've made commitments to, expand the search, we may give them a pass. But it's really those companies that currently do not have any diversity on their board, and we've seen openings, that's when we take action.
Okay, I think that's good to know. One of the things I should also mention is in terms of our sort of progression on this issue, we're sort of, you'll see when we do present the item, we've pulled away from specific numbers or quotas, recognizing that could have legal issues that we don't necessarily want to poke at, but recognize that we do care about progress and attitude and the things that you're mentioning. And so you'll see it in the item that we're going to present. But I'll just stop there because I know we're going to have probably a more extended discussion either in July or afterward. And so, but again, thank you for the good work that you're already doing, and I look forward to having further discussion.
One of the challenges, and you only glean this from conversations with companies, is around sort of the racial and ethnic diversity, because that necessarily isn't always disclosed in the proxy, and so you garner that information through dialogue and engagement.
Excellent, thank you.
Eddie?
Thanks, Harry. So Aisha, can you, just with respect to kind of a carrot and stick approach, but the threat of a no vote for the nominating committee or for the full board, is that having any kind of effect as you're doing the engagement?
It is, in terms of, it is our one way of making our voice known and heard. And if most of the board members are very accomplished people, and no one wants to see their vote lower than the person that sits next to them in the boardroom. So I think it does have an effect. I think you're also seeing a pickup in terms of other large asset management firms and other pension funds that see this issue as a very serious one, and no one wants to be that company that still has an all-white male board. And so you're seeing traction. It may not be as fast as we all would like it, but the companies are moving, and they're paying attention to their large shareholders.
Thank you.
Thanks, Betty. Aisha, no one else is in the queue, but a more general question. I heard a panel recently, where was it really? It's insignificant. The panel was on diversity of corporate boards. I think Scott Evans was on it from New York, and a couple of CIOs. One of the CIOs made a point about there's actually the diversity of background, skill sets, and thinking is equally important. The point that she made was that often we're looking at those traditional candidates. There's a subset within that group of males, white males. They all went to many of them go to the same school, belong to the same. A lot of them belong to the same. The point she made was it's not this broad universe. It's actually we're selecting from a very, very select micro subset of. So how do folks in your position and the people you speak to think about diversity of background and thinking and experiences when you talk about diversity?
Yeah, I would say that that's generally the pushback we get from companies when we talk about diversity in terms of gender and ethnicity, is they say, well, no, we want a diversity of background, of thoughts and thinking. I mean, that's sort of the, I would say, the lip service we often get from a lot of these companies. I think what we try to push back on is we see a lot of companies that emphasize, oh, we have 8 out of 12 CEOs that sit on our board. And I push back saying, well, tell me why that's a value add to the board. Because if you look at the makeup of CEOs in America, they're predominantly white males. And while I think that having that type of leadership is important in the boardroom, I also want to understand they're also going to think a lot alike. They're going to come from the same schools. And so I want them to expand that search and have other skill sets, that are related to industry, operations, maybe human resources, lots of different things that a board needs. And it needs to be a total aggregate of skill sets to run a, company.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
So we have 10 minutes before our speaker is going to be coming in through Skype. I think rather than try to get to any of these other items, which are all the semi-annual reports, is there anything else that we can do? Yeah, we can look at the draft agenda. That's a good idea.
No, it's scheduled 20 minutes, but I'm sure that could be faster.
Yeah, we could try to get through 8. Yep, we could try to do that. That's great. 8. Oh, yeah, you know what? Time out. We're going to take a break because they need to set up and get cameras up and phone calls in. So
You're off the hook.
we're going to come back at 1 o'clock with our speaker, Shantik, who's going to introduce the item and then introduce you, and then we'll hear from you and we'll do some Q&A. Okay? Great, and welcome. Paul?
25 minutes of kind of a overview of what she does and things that she's working on in terms of infrastructure. This item has been moved around because of what's been going on over the course of the week. Jane has a speech tomorrow, I believe, in New York at 9 o'clock with the governor involving LaGuardia. So it was one of those things where we couldn't get her in here and then get her back in time. And we have been a client of Meridian for a while, so we know Jane and the work that she does in the infrastructure and public-private partnerships. And plus, she's also, plugged into what is going on in terms of what's going on at the state and local and federal level in terms of infrastructure development. So with that, I would go ahead and turn it over to Harry, who will bring Jane in. And
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks for your work in the area of infrastructure. Jane, as part of the committee's work this past year, we've been hearing from thought leaders across different asset classes, and you being with us today, I'm sure will help inform us individually and collectively as to how we view infrastructure, the opportunities and risks that are presented for institutional investors like ourselves. So in terms of process, I think it would probably be best in terms of trying to facilitate this conversation is to first allow you to go through any presentation, your formal comments, and then we'll go to Q&A if that's okay.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So it's all yours now.
All right. Thanks very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to introduce my colleague, John Dionisio, who's also here with me. John heads all of our business development, but also has actually been involved in developing a number of the projects that we may mention today, and I thought if you had any specific questions, he would be a great resource for us. So I am pleased to be joining you today. I wish it were in person, but I look forward to doing that sometime in the future. Just by way of background, and I know you know a little bit about Meridian, but just to maybe summarize a bit, and John can certainly join in. We are a developer and investor in asset management, and mostly in greenfield, which is primarily new projects. So we're not buying brownfields and existing facilities, but really part of new infrastructure. And we were started by a very, I think, entrepreneurial gentleman by the name of Terry Doe, and he started the fund in 2005. And John and I like to talk about how he came to the decision to create Meridian. He really saw a niche in the marketplace that was sort of missing, and that is that there were a lot of investors in infrastructure, but they often got in and got out. And he was thinking about the notion that really having a fund that was long-term, that aligned itself with the life of the asset, that was closer to what the public sector wanted, that is a long-term investor, was really the sort of niche that he saw as perfect for Meridian. And it's been really a terrific opportunity. So we're very long-term. We're there for the long term, and I think that's a plus for the private sector, and certainly a plus for our investors as well. I have to say, I had an opportunity when I left government to join J.P. Morgan, which was very exciting in and of its own right, but very focused only on the sort of financial. And the wonderful thing about Meridian, from my perspective, it was as close as you could get to being in the public sector. That is, from the beginning to the end of a project, really seeing it all the way through. It was as close as you could get to the public sector without having to appear before a congressional committee. So that was good news for me, very good news. So Meridian now has about $7 billion under management. That's about 68 projects globally. Here in the United States, we have 15 projects that are well underway and doing very well, I might add. Our portfolio is strong and solid, and we're meeting the targets that we had set for ourselves. I think one of the unique things about our organization is that we have a breadth of professionals. We have people who have been involved in construction. We have people who have been involved in the financial side, and then people like myself who were part of the public sector for a number of years. So that sort of broad background, I think, really is a plus for us. The core values for Meridian, and two of our hallmarks, I think, is we put a very high premium on ESG. We put a very high premium on sustainability. So governance issues, social issues, environmental issues, all of those are really hallmarks of our projects. And if you take a look at them, and we can talk a little about it, the kind of relationships that we've had with the community, kind of relationships we have with the union is really paramount to us. And John, I don't know if you want to take a minute or so to talk about perhaps the kind of projects we've got in the portfolio now.
Sure. So, as Jane said, all of our projects represent long-term investors for Meridium and the fund. In the U.S., we are invested in projects in the road sector, in the rail sector, in the airport sector, and in the facility sector. Trying to go geographically, we are starting on the West Coast. We're a developer and investor in the Long Beach Courthouse project, which is fully in operations. We're a developer and investor in the Presidio Parkway project in San Francisco. We just recently closed in December of 2017 an investment in road improvement in Denver, Colorado, called the Central 70 project. We have 3 managed lanes toll road projects in the state of Texas. We are the developer investor in the Port of Miami Tunnel project in Florida, in the I-66 managed lanes project in Vienna, and certainly a project that's close to Jane, the developer in the LaGuardia Airport Central Terminal project. And that goes to show you our U.S. experience. We do have 3 projects in Canada, a road project, a light rail project, as well as a facility project. So it's been quite an active time here for Meridium in North America.
Yeah, I think one of the questions we often get asked is, how do you choose a project? How do you make a determination? And I think there are a number of characteristics. Because we often say to the public sector, look, P3s are not for every project. That's no question about that. But those very large, complicated projects where the public sector wants to share risk, wants to transfer some risk to the private sector, those lend themselves to a big P3. We also, frankly, look for a place where there's a real champion for a project. These are complicated and difficult, and having a community that stands behind a project and is solidly with it is really critical. And not simply because I'll be with the governor tomorrow, but the governor of New York, for example, has been a big proponent of P3s and the LaGuardia project. So he has really, against a number of odds, has really pushed that through. Very, very complicated. Just a word or two about that. Most projects can be complicated from an engineering point of view. This clearly is, because it's a very confined space. But the greater challenge is that you have to keep the existing airport or the existing terminal operating and going. So we've had to build really literally over the terminal and stage our construction in such a way to keep that terminal running and going. So that's been pretty challenging. You may have other questions on that. I'm happy to answer them. John, you want to talk a little about the future market here in the U.S.?
Sure. Yeah, the outlook is very positive for us, and our main focus remains the United States and Canada. We see so generally from a state perspective, there are over 35 states with P3 enabling legislation. I would say right now we are seeing activity in 10 to 15 states, about half of them who are procuring projects for the first time, and half who have actually been procuring P3 projects for quite a while. Texas is a good example, as is the state of California. Most of the activity for us remains in the transportation sector, largely road projects tendered by state departments of transportation. There are some transit projects that we are aligning ourselves on, And then there is a strong inflow of potential public facilities projects, from schools to courthouses to laboratory projects in the U.S. So there is diversity with respect to not only states, but also with respect to sector.
The other comment I would make in terms of just generally nationally, again, a lot of questions about what about President Trump's infrastructure plan? What does that mean for the future of P3s? What does it mean for the future of infrastructure? And I'm sure that a number of you have seen the legislation, or at least some summaries of the legislation. To the administration's credit, they did produce a bill. They did signal that infrastructure was important. I would say that the challenge may be that it calls for $200 million of federal funds, which I think most states and most localities would say was really a very small drop in the bucket. So I think the challenge will be, what will the federal participation be? And that will be debated, of course, in Congress. The president did also put a big emphasis on incentives, most of that money going to those localities that can raise about 80% of their own funds. So that's, again, for some localities, that's a real challenge. In California, I think Los Angeles has done a very good job of creating a revenue stream, and that certainly would be a big plus for them. Excuse me. But I do think one of the interesting parts about the Trump infrastructure plan is, even though we don't see it really going anywhere in Congress, it is really something that has been introduced, and it's also encouraged states, as John said, and localities to become much more proactive. So we're spending a lot of time with mayors, with governors, with state officials as they sort of think through some of the infrastructure. We're seeing a lot more activity at the local level, less reliance on the federal side, I would say. So with that, let me stop there and see if there are specific questions you'd like. And I apologize, and some of you may be struggling as well from some of the spring allergies, so apologize for that. Oh.
So thank you, Jane and John. Are there questions from the committee? I'm sure a few folks have some questions before I get to. I saw Jack Enos, our CEO, actually wanted to weigh in for a moment. Jack?
Hi, Jane. Good to hear from you. I was hoping we could draw off maybe in one of your other roles from your experience with the airline industry and just make a few comments for us. All of us are flyers here, and the challenges of flying experience and in the United States. Can you talk about the U.S. airlines industry a bit and just what you see as the path for getting it competitive with the non-U.S. airline industry, where people's experiences tend to be a lot better than ours? What do you see? Is this about getting the airport's infrastructure right first, or is it about getting the actual flying experience with our airlines different? Is there enough capital to make those changes in the airline industry? And what will this look like in the United States in 10 years for us as flying passengers?
Yeah, well, those are great questions, and I wish I had all the answers, but I'll make a couple of observations and comments. First, I do think the improvements to the terminals, the improvements to the airports is essential. I mean, it's one piece of it, but we're clearly seeing much more. We're seeing activity at O'Hare. They're taking on a huge project there. Obviously, LaGuardia, and by the way, in New York, the same activities are happening at JFK or about to happen at JFK. So the sort of commitment to really state-of-the-art terminals. Joe Biden's famous quote about LaGuardia is like entering a third world airport. So, yeah, he was right about a lot of things, I'd say. But I think there's certainly those efforts that are taking place, and we're seeing much more focus on that. The other interesting thing with the airlines themselves is there has been, and I think we will see even more of a shift to much more emphasis on customer service. Delta's done a good job of sort of bringing along some customer service issues. I think that's going to become a competitive aspect for the airlines, and if they really want to compete for the passenger, some of those customer service issues are going to be important. But there's also another side of it, which is even just the connections to the airports. You know, we sometimes think of airports in isolation, but as we all know, it's getting to the airport sometimes that's as challenging as the airport experience itself. So those intermodal links, I hope we see Congress, as they think through some of this legislation, I hope we see some attention paid to those intermodal corridors. I think those are really critical. And then I think finally, the air traffic control system. There's been a lot said about modernizing and reforming the air traffic control system. When I was with the Clinton administration, we came forward with an idea too for reforming air traffic control. We did not call for full privatization, though, but more of a government corporation that gave it much more flexibility. That's been pretty contentious on the Hill. But there are at least seven reforms that a group of us put together that we've suggested to Congress, part of a management advisory council last year to the FAA, but a series of changes that could be made that would give the FAA, give the air traffic control more flexibility to make some decisions that they need to make. They really need that stable funding. That's really been one of the challenges for them. So the question is, are there some short-term reforms you can put in place to at least move the ball? And I think there are, and I hope Congress looks at those seriously.
Thank you, Jane. So let me get to some committee members who have questions or comments. We'll start with Paul.
Thank you. This is actually an area I do know something about because I was a public finance banker for 30 years, and I was also ran the debt program for the state of California for a couple of years. So, Jane, I was effectively a competitor of yours for a while when you were at Morgan Stanley.
Right. Some of my best friends are my competitors.
What?
Some of my best friends are
mine too. Mine too.
The way to keep. Yeah.
So, So, you know, I've been around the discussion about P3s for 25 years now, and I think the issue that we need to struggle with here as investors is that what you described all sounds very consistent with what we're trying to do. You know, greenfield investments, long-term investments, ESG, all of that rings true to us. The problem has been that model of building infrastructure hasn't rung true to people in the public sector with the responsibility to build infrastructure. So it's not that we're not building infrastructure. We're actually building a tremendous amount of infrastructure in the United States. First of all, a lot is on pay-as-you-go basis, but I mean, the municipal bond market, you know, $400 or $500 billion a year, even if you take out the refundings, it's still hundreds of billions of dollars of new infrastructure every year. But the P3 market has such a small amount, and the reason is because those who promote P3s haven't yet figured out how to make them an attractive approach. You're absolutely right. P3s happen because there's a sponsor. The two California projects that you mentioned, the Long Beach Courthouse and the Presidio Parkway, had a sponsor. It was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Actually, for my fellow board members, it was really David Crane who told Arnold Schwarzenegger to push those. But when Schwarzenegger left as governor, the idea of those kinds of projects didn't ring true with the new administration. So the question I have, and I asked for some information about the investments we'd made in through our infrastructure program. And while, I've been on this board 6 years and we've tried to build up an infrastructure portfolio over that time, in 6 years, we've gotten to about $1.5 billion of U.S. infrastructure, which is well below where our target is. And so I'd like to know if you think there's a reason to think that P3s are going to take off in a way that they're going to make opportunities available for institutional investors like ourselves, because they just haven't yet. And you mentioned the Trump plan. I mean, the Trump plan, in my view, is actually a step backward on infrastructure, because by asking for 80% match, that's way more than locals had to put in before, right? So we take a look at something like building a new BART tube in the Bay Area, which would cost $10 or $12 billion. Well, it would be one thing if it was a 50-50 sharing. It's another thing if the locals have to come up with 80%. So what's different, and especially in the world of Donald Trump, which seems to make things go in the other direction? Why should we think that we're going to see an increase in the number of projects so that we can actually get to the goals we have? Because I keep being skeptical that we should be paying attention to this asset class, because I just don't think there's anything to invest in.
Well, let me start by saying I couldn't agree more with many of the comments that you've made. I think, again, we can talk about the engineering challenges with projects, but very often it's the political will. And I think historically, when you look at infrastructure in the United States, public infrastructure has always been viewed as exactly that. It's a public asset, and there is a reluctance to give up, I suppose, too much control. Our point with P3s, of course, is that you're not giving up control. In many ways, you have more control because you set the standards, and the private sector has to meet it. But I think it's really going to be a question of continued success stories, and I think we are seeing that. When we look at our pipeline, we do have an active pipeline. Do we have the numbers that we would like and that probably you would like? Definitely not yet. And it is a constant education in finding those champions and finding those places, those supporters out there who continue to sort of sell the story, if you will. Tomorrow, one of the meetings that we have is with the head of the Mayor's Conference of Mayors, who's very committed to infrastructure, and he's pulling together mayors to try to figure out how they can move forward with P3s at that level. So I think it's going to be a constant telling of the story and establishing a track record. There's much more interest in airports now after LaGuardia. There is certainly more interest in rail projects after Purple Line, where now with Purple Line and also the Denver Rail project. So I think it's taking certainly longer than we'd like, but I'm still optimistic on it. John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I would agree. I think the pipeline now, 2018, is deeper than it's been for the last decade, to Jane's point. And I do think that you're seeing different reasons from state and local authorities to enter into P3s. Some do it to accelerate delivery, tap on private sector resource because they might be resource constrained. Some do it to bridge a short-term finance gap to get projects started today that they otherwise wouldn't be able to bond against for a few years. And others do it for maybe a combination of reasons, but also they want to rid themselves of the long-term deferred maintenance challenges that some infrastructure projects have created in their state or their region. So you are seeing some commonality in terms of rationale. The trick is to make sure that the projects that are in the pipeline actually go through the pipeline, and that goes back to the public sector champion point.
Yeah, but there is one notion that's being debated or will be debated next year in Congress that I think could help greatly, and that is linking incentives to long-term maintenance. So that if you're thinking of an incentive program, or if you're thinking of access to whatever the federal dollars end up being, demonstrating that you've got some capacity for the long-term maintenance or provide for the long-term maintenance could also be a policy that the federal government or a state could put in place that really does, I think, act as a kind of encouragement to P3s.
We have
So
a couple of other. Can I just follow up with that? Because I'm going to move through I'll come back because we have 45 minutes. I will come back to you, Paul. And there are 3 other people in the queue, so I will come back. I'll come back to Paul. I want to get to 3 other people that are in the queue and try to keep this as close to our timed agenda as possible. So Steve, and then Betty, and then Joy. Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Garvey, thank you for the presentation. I enjoyed it. Wanted to almost step back for a moment and just talk about the nature of your investments and how much they all look alike in terms of revenue sources and how, in fact, we could expect to get our return from those investments. So if you could just briefly describe if there's a general nature of these P3s or whatever the infrastructure investment might be, or are there variations that would produce different sort of revenue streams?
question, John, is
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll take a stab at that. With respect to revenue sources, if you were to generalize it into 2 major categories, there's the projects that we consider revenue risk projects, where we rely on detailed analysis in terms of how are we going to capture users to pay tolls. So the revenue risk project is one category, and the second category is availability-based projects, where irrespective of the users paying a toll or not, the government commits to pay us, the investor, for performance to the extent that the road or piece of infrastructure is maintained, potholes are filled, cracks are filled, accidents are responded to. In the case of a facility, the roof isn't leaking, spills are corrected. If to the extent we do these things, the government appropriates money to pay us. That's the other category. And the way we holistically look at risk transfer from a fund perspective is to have a mix. What the revenue risk projects do that the availability payment projects don't do is provide you a better inflation hedge, albeit expose you to more user risk. And so we try to have a blend. In the second fund of Meridium, it's called Meridium Infrastructure North America 2, I believe the mix was 60% availability payment projects, 40% revenue risk projects, and I think that's an assumption that based on where the market is, we think we can carry forward. Does that answer your question?
It answers it exactly. Thank you. Adroitly. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Betty?
Thanks, Harry, and thank you for the presentation. Couple of questions, and I was happy to hear you address long-term maintenance because that always seems to be the neglected part of the infrastructure discussion. So the use of incentives to really be sure that we're caring for that aspect of the project is critical. I had a couple questions with respect to the current U.S.-China tension and kind of your thoughts with respect to the role of foreign investment in public infrastructure. And then secondly, any impacts with respect to global supply chains?
Well, I would certainly say that in terms of capital, there's plenty of capital in the United States, and I've certainly a number of the pension funds that we deal with are in North America. Would say that capital is not the problem. We have in our fund we do not have any Chinese investors, and a number of the P3 companies, of course, are based originally in Europe, but they have established U.S. subsidiaries here in the United States. So to date, we've not seen any particular issues around that. But is there an area that you're particularly concerned about?
No,
or?
it's just really more of the conversation back in Washington DC around foreign investment, and so just wanted to see if there was any spillover into this. And then I was curious with respect to your transportation project specifically, at what point do you factor in kind of what transportation looks like in the future, particularly autonomous transportation, and how that affects project design?
That's a great question, and we have a number of provisions in our when we think about the contracts that call for improving technology and emerging technologies as you move forward. So we take that into account fairly early on. We just are involved in a project that we're pursuing now, and one of the issues is what will be the future with cars and driverless cars and so forth. And we spend a fair amount of time talking to some of the experts, meeting with both some of the academicians as well as some of the auto companies to see how they're thinking about it and see what their views are. And I think one of the keys that we have to keep reminding ourselves is we don't always know what the future will be. So are these contracts and is what we are doing flexible enough, allow for enough flexibility to respond to those? And that's certainly part of the way we think about the contracts, the way we think about the designs. I will say that we have lots of incentives, but of course, because we're there long term, we have lots of incentives to use the most state-of-the-art technology that's available now. So, for example, the Long Beach Courthouse cost us a little more on the heating system, but we knew long term that was going to be beneficial to us as the concessionaire, that would save us money in the long run. So those kind of investments we may do up front with the notion that it will benefit us in the long term and the project.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joy?
Thank you. Ms. Garvey, thank you very much for your presentation. I was really helpful. I found it interesting. You know, the projects that we're talking about here are all subject to political risk because they're public-private partnerships. You know, there might be changes in administration, changes in state or municipality budgets. I guess stepping back and thinking about our role as a board, can you just give us some insight onto the kinds of things that we should think about as we look at infrastructure projects and how we evaluate the risks, since some of the elements of that risk are a little bit different than in some of our other investments?
Right. No, that's a very good point, and we certainly spend a great deal of time thinking about that and strategizing about that. But I think one of our starting points is we choose those projects that are absolutely critical to a community or critical to an infrastructure system. So, for example, we would not be likely to do a sports stadium. That might be the project of a mayor or a governor, but then might lose its favor with the next administration. And something like the Long Beach Courthouse, which, by the way, survived as was indicated earlier, started with the Republican administrator and yet was supported by his successor. And that's because it was so critical to the court system. So we look at the criticality of the project, and I think that's an important thing as you're looking at projects as well, or as you're considering portfolios. Those that have to do with the most essential aspects of a community or a network, I think are places where we would put the emphasis. LaGuardia was another example. There are a number of airports we probably would not have done, but there's no getting around the fact that LaGuardia is really kind of the linchpin of the aviation system. I don't know, John, anything to add?
I think that's well put. I think apart from the criticality and essentiality argument, which is a cornerstone of our approach, understanding the procurement process, whether the public sector authority has hired the prerequisite experts, legal, technical, financial advisors who are critical to advise the public sector in terms of understanding best practices and negotiating with the private sector is one of the things we look at before committing financial and personnel resources to a project. And then ensuring that the contract that we ultimately sign with the government counterparty has the appropriate change in law provisions that protect us from something that might be discriminatory over a 30 to 40-year relationship, that deals with consequences of termination for failure to appropriate, and really ensure that we're asking ourselves some of the more doomsday questions to ensure that the contractual structure has the robustness to withstand potential political risks that might arise in our long-term relationship with the granting authority.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you for that. I'm looking at the time. We're pushing up to about 40 minutes or so. I wanted to get back to to Paul's, wanted to loop back in to have him continue with any follow-up questions. I don't see anyone else in the queue. So I'm going to go to Paul. I have a few comments, maybe a question at the end, and then we'll let you finish the session for us. So we're down to about the last 5 minutes. I'll go to Paul.
Thank you, Harry. So I just have one question. Given the pace at which the P3 market is increasing, and given the fact that we as a pension fund need to adopt an asset allocation model that hopes to have a certain amount of our money invested in different asset classes, we're right now about 0.2% of our total portfolio is in U.S. infrastructure. What do you think we can reasonably expect that to grow to over the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Wow, I'm not sure I can.
Go ahead. Why don't you see if you want to answer it?
We need that answer when we do our asset allocation study.
Let's see if they want to answer that, and then you'll understand why I almost jumped in.
If there's anybody who's an expert,
no, yeah, exactly.
They see the supply.
So do you have an opinion on how large of a slice of the pie that should become for us?
And who the competitors are?
We meet people all the time who don't have an opinion. So, I mean, it's okay if you say, no, you don't.
Yeah.
No, I don't, but I'm going to ask John.
Well,
yeah.
That's great. It's fine.
Short in an opinion.
Yeah.
I think let me answer a question that is maybe slightly different, but gets to the same point. When we ask ourselves, what's a healthy P3 market, and when you define, Paul, when you're defining infrastructure, our answers are always in the lens of P3. So there might be ways to allocate infrastructure dollars to projects that are infrastructure but might not be long-term contracted projects with public sector counterparts. So when we say to ourselves, what would make a healthy P3 market where where we will be able to invest the amount of money we raised over 5 years, I would say the market, if you average out deals closed in the last 5 years, a good market when in any given year about 5 projects are closed. And if each project requires $200 million of equity, that's $1 billion of equity opportunity a year on average. Some projects like LaGuardia maybe meet that threshold. Other projects like the Long Beach Courthouse are a bit smaller. So that's sort of what we look at. In any year, are there 5 essential P3 projects that are closing? And if that happens, then I think that we'll be able to deliver what we want to deliver.
Well said.
Thank you for that. Let me, Alan Emkin, who's one of the consultants to the committee, wants to weigh in. Alan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question I have is, STRS has been looking at developing collaborative platforms and innovative ways of accessing private markets, particularly to address alignment of interest, transparency, and fees. Do you think the potential exists to build relationships outside of the traditional limited partnership agreement?
Give me an example, please, if you would.
Co-investment.
Oh,
Co-investment.
Yeah.
And/or direct investment on projects where they would invest alongside you, even if they weren't a limited partner.
I think, yeah, we certainly have talked about that, and we're certainly considering that in some cases. I mean, I will say that currently we have so many of our current investors in the fund who are interested in co-investment with us, that if there are potentials that we like to give them, we like to obviously offer them the first possibility. But I will tell you that in newer areas that we're looking at, for example, in the area of energy and some of those areas, we think that there may be some real opportunities for exactly what you've described. And John, you have been working on a couple of those, like in that.
Yeah, I think the opportunity for co-investment increases with the risk of the project, because with more risk means less gearing. Less gearing means more equity. And our approach always is to ensure that no more than 15% of the fund is spent on an existing asset. So there are revenue risk projects like the roads in Texas, like the road in Virginia, hopefully like the road program that Maryland DOT is embarking on. There will be a prime opportunity for co-investors that we would, and the market would, whether it's us or whoever else wins, would offer to interested investors. And so it's certainly something that a lot of our LPs are interested in. On the availability payment side, where you're able to increase the gearing to 88 or 90% of the project, those equity tickets tend to be a little bit smaller on average, so they don't provide the best co-investment opportunity. So it really is a question of risk as opposed to anything else, at least in my mind.
Yeah, and I think some of the new areas that we look at, there may be more opportunities, as we mentioned.
Yeah, the energy market that you mentioned. Yeah, as we expand into contracted energy where you have the same criticality and essentiality arguments, but the debt community might not necessarily be as well primed to lend up to 90% of the capital structure, then those are great opportunities for co-investment.
Right.
Thank you for that. The reason I chuckled when Paul asked his question is I think it really is at the heart of what we have some control over here as a committee, is to the size of the slice of the pie in our asset allocation that we think is appropriate for infrastructure as we try to get a 7% return over the next 30 years. And, you know, I'm smart enough to know that I'm not the expert on infrastructure or the financing of infrastructure. And I also know I'm the eternal optimist. So those are like my blind spots, and I'm aware of what they are. But when the need for investment in American infrastructure is so well documented, some would argue it's a national security issue. When you think about the Chinese, they're talking about a Silk Road to transform 21st century commerce across the globe. And they will get, I believe they will get that done. And we think about what we're trying to accomplish here, and it's more stressful for me to travel from Santa Monica down Lincoln Boulevard to fly on a certain airlines to come to Sacramento than it is for me to fly into Heathrow or to Hong Kong. And you land and you're like, wow, what an experience. It's literally more stressful to come up, and just the need is so great, and our country's need to invest in our future is significant. So the need is there, the public need is there. The big question is who pays for it. So big picture stuff, if public pension funds can find a way to help pay for the public need and do a public good, and the people smarter than myself can figure out the financing and the projects and then partner, so it's the 4 Ps, the public need, the public pensions, the public good, and then the partnerships. If people can find out how we can do that, we then can determine, and I've sat in enough meetings where people are talking about, you know, what size of the pie will infrastructure play in helping pension funds meet their needs into the future, especially if we use today as the starting line and we look at other asset classes and the pricing of other asset classes. So really smart people are talking about this. I'm optimistic. I think it is about storytelling. I think it is about creating a track record where this can happen and getting to a position of yes, as opposed to as to why we won't do it. Because the why we won't do it, the cost of doing that to our society is just so great. But it's critically important that Chris and Paul find the right partners and the right projects. So if it's 1% today, maybe it will be 2% in the future. And I think that's the policy question we have to wrestle with, is how large of a pie does this actually potentially pay, and where does it come from within our overall asset allocation to meet our long-term 7% objective. So that's the eternal optimist. So I leave it to people who are smarter than I am to figure out which projects and with whom to invest and how it would work, because we have to get to 7 somehow. That's really what we're trying to do. We got to get the ball across the finish line, right? Anyone else with questions or comments? If not, I'll leave it to you if you have final thoughts or anything you want to leave us with. Good luck with LaGuardia. You said you like complicated and challenging opportunities. There's nothing more complicated than LaGuardia and New York politics.
New York politics in particular. Let me just say, first of all, I wish I were there in person, and I look forward to, both John and I do, to visiting, because we would welcome that, and certainly welcome anytime you're in New York and would like a tour of LaGuardia. We'd love to give it to you. But I do want to say how much we enjoy our relationship with CalSTRS, and I think the basic reason, and we've talked about this, and Terry talks about this a lot, is because we share many of the same values and many of the same goals. And you talk about doing public good and linking ourselves to communities and so forth. That is so much, I think, of what you stand for, and I hope we do as well. So I hope we're as a good a partner to you as you are to us. So thanks very much for having us today.
Well said, and we look forward to meeting you in person in the future. Thank you very much. Paul?
Harry, if I could just follow up.
Yeah, please do.
A couple of points. One of the things that's brought up, and sometimes maybe not be clear, is that 2/3 of spending on infrastructure happens at the state and local government level. So the federal government's role is relatively small. So when she was talking about education, it is really a matter of being at state and local and dealing with those people to get projects done. So it's really block and tackling at a very basic level. It's not high level, because this is it's a newer strategy to most state and local government people. So I just want to clarify that. It's 2/3 of it happens at the state and local level. So the federal government's part of that is relatively small. The other thing I wanted to point out too is that within the infrastructure portfolio, P3s are a part of it. There's a small part of it. You said the market's probably like 10 to 12%. I mean, within the infrastructure market, energy is totally deregulated. That's a big part of it. So transmission, pipelines, wind, solar, that's a big part of our portfolio and a big part of the infrastructure market. So what we're talking about, when people talk about infrastructure, they're usually talking about things like LaGuardia and Presidio Parkway and roads and toll roads. That's a part of it, but the infrastructure markets consists of a lot of other things. What's interesting about what Meridian does is they're in the middle of a lot of these discussions that you'll hear at the federal level in terms of LaGuardia, in terms of trying to take particularly large pieces of infrastructure and either build them from scratch or, like she said, build over what's presently there. So just 2 points I wanted to make.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Helpful. Seeing no other comments or questions. Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much. Okay. We're at item 13 already?
Already?
Ready? Yeah, Brian. Yeah, Brian. Brian. Sorry, Brian. Come on up.
Good afternoon.
Hey, Brian.
So what we have before you is item 8. It's the ESG policy revision. When you last considered this in February, there were some requests made to revise the policy, bring it back to you at today's meeting. 3 main areas. One, there was a request to reword paragraph 3 of the policy. There was a belief that how we had categorized the headings, where we called it the policy was more procedures and the procedures were the policy. So we reversed those. And then there was an issue around one of the risks, indigenous people's rights, and how the concept of property rights could probably be expanded so that all people's property rights should be considered. And so we decided to break that out into a separate risk. All of those changes are captured in attachment 3 to the item. It was also requested that we bring back the February version so that you could do a side-by-side comparison. That was provided as attachment 2. Also, one of the board members came to us recently after the printing and had some further suggestions around the language, particularly around making the language on the risk factors more consistent. We thought that that was a good suggestion, and we wanted you to have an opportunity to consider that. So what we provided you this morning was another revision, which includes that language. And to try to help you to be more clear, the highlighted portion of that document is the changes that we made to attachment 3. So you were provided with a clean version and then a red line version, and the highlighted portions are what the changes were to attachment 3. And it's also in the back for the public if they want to take a look at it. So you also had asked for staff and consultant opinions as to which version was preferred. In the executive sum of the attachments, we were all in agreement that what was the attachment 3 would be the preferred language. However, it's staff's opinion that what you have in front of you today is the most preferred language, and the consultants haven't had a chance to opine, so I would let them do that and then open it up to questions.
I think Makita's in agreement that the attachment 3 plus the highlighted language that's in front of you today is the current best policy before you.
Thank you. And Makita's opinion is on INV 65, and then it's noted with your adding. Alan, any?
Good.
Fine. Okay. Any questions or comments from the committee? It is an action item.
So moved.
Okay, it's been moved.
Second.
Seconded. Any questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Done.
Hallelujah! Hallelujah!